if anybody Googles your name and doesn't do their due diligence, tell me if you can add to this, okay? So feel free to add, and I'll let you correct it one by one. But you are this horrible transphobe who wrote this terrible book. You took some people's personal histories without their knowledge. You threw it out for the world to see without them even knowing that you were going to do this. You slept with a number of them. You exploited them. You manipulated them in this very Svengali way. You exploited them in front of your class and paraded them like a bunch of freaks. And on top of all that, just a couple of years ago, you also had some people, not trans people, but committing these horrific sex acts in front of, I'll just say children, just to really ramp it up. Okay, this is the kind of monster that's running around Northwestern University. And how the hell have you not been completely fired, if not, run out of town there? But you're just destroying a whole bunch of people's lives. And by the way, by me having you on here and me giving you a forum to actually speak about what really happened, I've gone down that rabbit hole, by the way. I've read your website. I've read all these different sides because as a critical thinker, I don't look at one side. I look at this all around side, right? So I've gone down those rabbit holes. I've lost sleep over this. Please feel free to kind of tell the background on the story. The book was The Man Who Would Be Queen, which ironically was very well received originally by the trans community, all right? So someone's trying to highlight our story. They're putting our story, it's giving exposure. Exposure is good. It's letting people see that there's a human being behind this label or behind this phenomenon or construct. We did with homosexuality in the 1970s and early 70s with Robert Spitzer and so on. So there was a good reception, and then things just turned around really dramatically.
Before I begin, I own the copyright to my book, and you are welcome to share it on your site as a PDF. Everybody should read it. It is published in 2003. It remains every word true, and there's a lot that most people don't know in there. Briefly, the background of the book. I was interested in studying transsexuals and drag queens in the mid-90s. I met a transsexual who contacted me because she was interested in telling me about herself. And this person was very unusual and shattered my assumptions about transsexuals, at least half of them. And to understand her, I rediscovered the science of transsexualism. The person in the book who I call Cher,
right,
and her real name is Angelica Celtica. She's out as her, and her life story makes it very clear that her transition was strongly erotically motivated. As a young teenager, back then he discovered that he was very turned on by wearing women's lingerie, looking at himself in the mirror and masturbating. Did this for a long time, and then went away to college and was kind of artsy and discovered that it was really a turn on to simulate female features, from hair and a mask to actually fake breasts. And then ultimately, the most erotic thing was to wear a fake vulva and look at herself in the mirror and masturbate and so on. So this was a type of transsexual that I had not known about, and most people don't know about it. This is the kind of transsexual that turns out to be the most common of male to female who get sex changes in the West. This kind of transsexual, I strongly believe, based on what I know about her, applies to Caitlyn Jenner, for example. Even though Caitlyn Jenner has never talked about this, based on her features, that is what I would bet a lot of money on. And the motivation has been called autogynephilia. Auto, self, gyna, woman, philia, love of. So autogynephilia is a man's sexual arousal by the fantasy of becoming a woman or being a woman. That's only one reason why men get sex changes or why males get sex changes. The other is perhaps more familiar, and I also wrote about this in the book. This would be best thought of as an extremely feminine gay man, one who is so comfortable being a female, so feminine that they decide that they would just be happier as women. Furthermore, they really are paying a lot of attention, I believe, to how they would look as women and how they would do on the mating market with straight men. What was really important is that Angelica was embedded in a community of this other type. So I got to see them right next to each other, interact with them, and they're just so different. They're like night and day. Most people don't get to see the two types, and if you do, you really have to be blind to miss it. If you don't, well, the autogynephilic transsexuals, most of them don't tell you about autogynephilia. They don't tell you in part because they're worried that you'll think they're weird, but also they like to emphasize how they're like women and having this unusual paraphilia, this sexual interest that they have is more of a male thing. They don't like to emphasize that. When it became clear to me that autogynephilia is a thing, an important thing, you can't really understand male to female transsexualism without understanding it, I thought to myself, I should tell people about this. And again, this is another idea that originated in Canada at CAMH. This is another of Ray Blanchard's ideas. He's the scientist who did all the work.
Right, he came up with a taxonomy.
Yeah. I just discovered his work after meeting these people, and I thought I should write like a popular science book. And what nailed it for me is that I went to this book release reading at Barnes & Noble, where Randy Etner, who's a clinical psychologist, was talking about transsexualism using the tired, old, false narrative that they're all women trapped in men's bodies and they were always like women. Well, Angelica was never a woman trapped in a man's body, and actually the transsexual Anne Lawrence, who's written a great book about this, says they're not women trapped in men's bodies, they're men trapped in men's bodies. They do not have the souls of women. They have the erotic interests of heterosexual men, except that their target is not women on the outside, it's a woman that they create on the inside. I know your audience, if they've never heard this before, this is going to be hard for them, and that's another reason why they should read my book. I think that I do a good job of introducing this idea.
One of the difficulties I have in today's climate is when people say that my lived experience trumps science, trumps reality, trumps, stuff like that, okay? So we have to listen to my lived experience. But in a case like this, here's the thing. One of the biggest controversies with this taxonomy is that there's not the third category, which is what you alluded to. I've had patients who have said, look, it's not anything to do with this, this autogynephilia. It's just that truly, I do not feel like I'm in the right body. I still love women. Okay, is there not a possibility that there's that third category of people?
There's certainly a possibility that there's a third category, though I don't think that there is any evidence for it, and there's plenty of evidence that males with autogynephilia will try to hide that. Let me clarify that lots of autogynephilic males are very open about it, and I've been thanked more than attacked for my book in private by people who say, for the first time I understand myself.
I think Andrea James also did that. She wrote to you and thanked you.
No, well, Andrea James, by the time she wrote me a very snide email. But there's a record, an email record she wrote to Anne Lawrence.
Oh, to Anne Lawrence, sorry.
She praised the idea of autogynephilia and said that, she totally fits the picture and thought Blanchard was a genius. And of course, then she, several years later, erected a website dedicated to how evil I am and how wrong autogynephilia was.
Right. I'm going to quote here. There are two types of children in the Bailey household. type 1 who have been sodomized by their father, or type 2 who have not. And Andrea James had originally, just because we're going to talk, I mean, that's part of the controversy, she's one of the leaders of this, charge against you. She had put on her website pictures of your children, right, with those headings, and she defended by saying, well, if he puts this taxonomy of, either they are a cock-starved exhibitionist who's especially well-suited to prostitution, okay, or he's an extremely feminine gay who likes to work, female types of professions, okay? Like, she says if he's constructing these two categories, why can't I? That's kind of like, that was my read of her generalization. Why can't I say that about his children? And I know she took down the pictures, and she put her own pictures up there now as a child. Just so people know, if they look up Andrea James, she has done some very public and reprehensible actions, I believe. Bring your children into it and everything, are very, very personal.
Yeah, I have the pages saved, and if anybody would like to see them for historical reasons, they can write me and I'll share them. Okay. It was actually upsetting to my daughter at the time, but she got over it, sticks and stones and so on. And she actually, for a brief time on her Facebook page, had the self-description, cock-starved exhibitionist. I thought that's cool that she was not going to be permanently scarred by Andrea James being unhinged. And Andrea James is to be avoided. I strongly recommend anybody in your audience to stay clear.
I thought it was important to bring up because it's part of the narrative. I think a lot of people, until she started crossing lines, felt sympathetic toward her because she felt that your characterization of trans people or transsexual was very hurtful, and that's what we're hearing today. And that's why I think
she didn't feel that.
Well, that's how
what she said. I mean, unless she had a brain tumor or something that totally changed her from back in the day. She's a disciple of Lynn Conway, who spearheaded this. And if I had to speculate, I would guess that she was receiving living expenses. But, I don't know that for sure, but that would be my guess. So there were 3 transsexual women mainly who were leading the charge. Andrea James, we just talked about. A second, who's a world-famous economist, Deidre McCloskey, wrote an autobiography in which she talks about fetishistic cross-dressing and masturbating and being aroused by transsexual pornography, all of these very common manifestations of autogynephilia. She never used the word, but, And then Lynn Conway is the one she's a very famous electrical engineer from University of Michigan, and she has never admitted autogynephilia, but, of course, my guess is that she's closeted and ashamed, and I'm sorry she's ashamed for autogynephilia. I'm not ashamed of autogynephilic people. Anyway, when the book came out, Lynn Conway launched this campaign against me in which she compared my book to Nazi propaganda, even though my book had been praised as being very sympathetic to the people in it. That included about very feminine boys, gay men, transsexuals. I had been nominated for a Lambda Award, which is an award for GLBT humanitarian kinds of books.
Which was retracted because of the pressure.
Yeah, that was stressful. Andrea James, she took pictures of my children from my website and from when they were kids. Maybe Kate was 7, and Drew, my son, was 9 or 10, and put them on her site with these obscene captions, falsely drawing parallels to anything I'd written in my book. That was creepy, and my daughter was disturbed. I didn't like that, but it really got terrible when Lynn Conway traveled to Chicago, met with Angelica, the trans woman I talked about, and some of the other people I had written about, and she basically turned them against me and convinced them that I was evil.
Right. The other one being in your book, Juanita.
Juanita, yeah, that's right.
Now, just before we go further on that, because I think that's so important to, again, to look at the reality behind the headlines, because nobody does that anymore, it seems. Like, they see this headline, it jives with what they want to believe, or it just gets them all riled up and they get to, lash out, and they don't actually look at the story. So I want to go to that story, but I do want to say clearly, because if people are watching this, I personally, and this is where you and I, this is the one, I think, disagreement that we will have, because you talked about the research behind or the evidence behind it. I personally, again, I am willing to hold open this possibility, again, especially based on the people I've spoken with, that third category is legitimate. And I mean, I'm not going to proclaim to know everything about that. And, whether it's a mental illness, whether it's just, it's a way of being. I don't believe it's a spectrum, as some people are trying to say. I do believe that there is a correlation between our chromosomes, and our, being male or female. I believe in that part of the science. But I do believe that, personally, again, that certain people may have been born, with wires crossed in a way that they do not feel that, their physical sex matches their, their sense of who they are. By saying that, I want to be very clear to other people who watch this. I don't think a 3-year-old child, a girl who says, I'm a boy, that the parents at all start saving up money for sex reassignment surgery, because we do know, the research does show that the vast majority of children who have this feeling of, I'm confused or I'm not quite sure about who I am or what I am, because their identity, not just gender or sexual identity, but the identity of who they are as a human being is not that well established at such young ages. And I don't agree that we should be pushing people in a direction, so prematurely. So I just want to put that out there. I have feet on both sides there, basically.
Well, you're saying that like you're disagreeing with me, but what I believe and what I wrote in the book is that there are 2 known motivations for males getting sex changes, and one of them is autogynephilia, which, autogynephilic males do feel that they really want to get sex changes, and they feel a lot of dysphoria being in a male body sometimes. And the other kind is what I might call androphilic, the ones who from day one were extremely feminine and they just never came out of it, and they just want to get, they are like the little 5-year-old boys who want to be girls, except that they never desisted like is most common. So those are the 2 known motivations. I have not said, nor do I believe there might not be another motivation, but to me, somebody saying I'm not either of those isn't sufficient for me to believe them. If I was seeing them in therapy, I wouldn't say, nah, I don't believe you. I would work with them on their own terms, but I don't believe most people who say, no, I'm not this type or that type.
But I will say one thing, and I say this to my students as well. The theory of asexuality, for example, and Tony Bogart, who actually it was one of my colleagues many years ago. That's how I got into teaching him in sexuality. I took over from him for a couple of years when he was on sabbatical, who worked with Ray Blanchard as well, as you know. The theory is that with asexual people, I don't know if all or the vast majority claim there's nothing wrong inherently. It's not historically that I had something bad happen to me or that I'm trying to repress my sexuality or anything like that. I just don't have this sexual urge or this libido. Whereas, and I've had patients who came to me saying the same narrative, like, no, there's nothing wrong with my history. I'm totally normal. I just don't have any sex drive. Yet, through therapy, and I've only had 3 cases, I have to always be clear, I've only had 3 cases where in therapy, after they felt more comfortable with me and they felt safer, suddenly we realized, oh, there was a history. 2 of them happened to, we would consider as gay, but unfortunately early on, they had a traumatic experience where, being who they are, being gay, was the worst thing in the world in their family, and they repressed it, and that seems to be the nature of their asexuality. The third person had another traumatic, it wasn't homosexual, but there was a traumatic experience early on where they learned to suppress or repress those sexual urges. So I'm not saying that all people who are asexual who claim that there's nothing wrong with their history are lying or are not true. But I'm just saying that, to your point, when people claim one thing, or they say, for historically, I always knew I was different or whatever, our histories, we know with the science of memory, are sketchy at best, our recall and everything. So I understand where you're coming from that. I'm much more tentative in that regard, I think, than you are. I just want to throw that out there, just to further complicate the matter, because it is a complicated matter, and why can't we not have this discussion? Well, I guess the reason we can't is because we're both not transgender. Okay, that disqualifies us from trying to speak about this, and trying to understand, and trying to help. So anyway, I wanted to put that all in there, and then I wanted to now go back to this idea that let's peel back the veneer, let's look at the monster behind all of this and see, oh, maybe it's not such a monster after all. With Angelica, for example, and if you don't mind talking about this perhaps, or please do, your relationship with her prior to her being turned, with you and your students and trying to, can you talk about that? Oh, and plus one more thing I forgot to mention before we go for, because I just don't want to forget this. You also acted unethically because you tried to do something that, as a non-clinical psychologist, you are not allowed to do. Shame on you for being such a bad person for doing this. And again, I will allow you afterwards to explain the reality behind that headline, because I think what you did was anything but shameful, and you were very clear and upfront about what you were doing. You weren't trying to deceive anybody. You were using your own expertise to try to help somebody. But we'll get to that as well. I just want to put that out there. That was the thing I forgot to throw at you. So getting back to Angelica, would you mind talking about your relationship with her?
I liked Angelica. She was a character. She was one of these people who, even if you like them, eventually you have to do something else in your day, and it's hard to get away from. She just did not stop talking and so on. But I enjoyed talking to her. She definitely introduced me to people and to ideas and her own story and so on. She was a real exhibitionist. She loved telling people about herself. At the time, I taught a very large class in human sexuality, and I had the idea that it would be great if she plus another transsexual of the other kind came to class, because I really do think it's seeing the two side by side which really has you appreciate that there are two types. And she was more than game to do this. This happened the first time, gosh, I don't know, maybe it was 1995 or 6 or something like that. And this may have been the time that at the end of her presentation, she ripped off her clothes and showed everybody her naked body and so on. So exhibitionist. We did that presentation every year until the last year was 2003, and then after that we were no longer friends. Also, we would get together. Sometimes I'd take her out to eat, or we would, I don't know, sometimes she would want to show me like a transsexual review or something like that. There were places where transsexuals would perform. Juanita, the other transsexual woman I wrote about who turned on me, Angelica and I went to her wedding together. We had a cordial relationship. She was a character, and there was only so much room in my life for her, but we did fine. And I wrote the section of the book about them, and I showed this to her. This was in the late 90s, and she was very upset because of the way that I conceptualized her as autogynephilic and also as not naturally feminine. I think it hurt her feelings, and she had before said, well, just use my real name. I'm not ashamed of anything. But at that point, she said, if you're going to write about me this way, change my name. She did not at that point say, you can't write this, though she hoped to change my mind about some things. And I'm not sure if she had said, you can't write this, I'm not sure what I would have done. It's I think you really have to get people's permission to write about them by another name. But she never did that. Again, that was in the late 90s, maybe 1997, 98, and we didn't have our falling out till 2003. So it's not like that. Yeah, we had this cordial, I think mutually respectful relationship until Lynn Conway, in the context of her investigation of me came to Chicago, and she contacted. I don't know how she found out how to contact Angelica, but she did. You know, Angelica was such a character; it was not that hard for people to figure out who she was.
Although, if I can interject for a second,
Yeah.
two of the women who sued you, I don't know if it was sued or they launched a complaint, who said that you were writing about them. Can you say about that? The irony about the two other women who said that you had written about them?
Are you saying that they said that I wrote about them and I didn't?
Yeah,
Is that what you mean? Yeah,
yes.
right.
I just want people to understand that if you read the headlines, it looks like you tricked people, you deceived people into opening up, telling their life story, and then surprisingly, without their knowledge, put a book out there to humiliate them. And two of the women who basically claimed that weren't even the people that you were writing about. That was what happened, yes?
That's right. And yes, they so knew I was writing a book that there was actually an article in the Northwestern student newspaper from the late 90s that had both Angelica and Juanita. Juanita's not a real name, but it was about them coming to my class. It had pictures of them as boys and as current, and both of them talked about the book. And this was in the late 90s, so there was no surprise.
You know, you were also cleared of any wrongdoing at the university because you weren't actually conducting research.
The way that they really got to me in terms of affecting my life was that they did lodge a complaint at my institutional review board, which for people not part of universities, that's an ethics board that regulates research. And they said that I was doing research without approval. And I had never thought of this book as research. You know, research is when you set out with an idea that you want to study and you collect data from people. Whereas what I thought I was doing was using stories of people who I had met to explain Ray Blanchard's ideas. The IRB system is a very controversial system, and it has become a way for people to attack others whose ideas they don't like, and that's what happened to me.
And again, I think that's just so important for people to really digest. This happened, I mean, the book came out in 2003. I forget when that whole review happened. It was around the same time, no?
The review of about the
the
investigation of me. So my book was published in the spring of 2003. The complaint was lodged around my birthday in July of 2003. It took a couple of years to resolve everything, and it was very stressful.
We're talking almost 15 years ago, and only now are we seeing more and more professors, researchers, anybody trying to, again, ask these important questions. They may be uncomfortable, but the only way you learn, the only way you grow as a person is to step out of that comfort zone, to expose yourself to that which makes you uncomfortable. And again, that's why I wanted to have you on here, because more and more people are talking about it now. Dr. Jordan Peterson from Toronto, another person that I've spoken with as well, you know, he's kind of the face of all of this, and he's, you know, leading the charge and saying this is scary. And I just want people to know that it's not a new phenomenon. You know, it happened before you, but you, again, this was 2003. I think it was around that time that I first learned about this and what was going on with it. Maybe I learned about 2005. I'm not sure, okay? But I just want people to appreciate this is nothing new. You're one of the early victims.
Yeah, I've wondered whether he knows anything about what happened to me and about autogynephilia. It's not clear from what I've seen, but yeah, he's certainly currently being attacked by some of the same kinds of people who attack me.
The fact is that it would be ignorant to pretend that there aren't hateful people out there, that there aren't people who are looking for any type of evidence to try to destroy or to discredit or to pretend that certain people don't exist. And so I can understand why people would be skeptical and you know, cautious. But once they've spoken with you, and here's the dilemma that we're in here, okay? And going back to that paper that we talked about, the selecting for heterosexuality, even with your disclaimer at the beginning saying, we're saying there's nothing wrong with homosexuality, even saying that, people are saying, well, that's just like, you know, a racist saying that some of my best friends are black, right? You can't win. You know, and I want to ask you about that because you've lived this experience. I haven't to any degree. I get flack anytime I mention any of this. I'm a homophobe, I'm a transphobe. I have to bring out my personal experience, my personal life, the work that I do clinically in teaching. And they say, no, some people will never want to hear that. Okay, so I want to ask you, for somebody who has either neutral or positive motives in the scientific inquiry or any type of trying to understand these phenomena, okay, who aren't hateful by nature, what can somebody do? Because you've been through this. What can somebody do to try to convince others? I'm not talking about the 99th percentile, the ones who are on the extreme end of who will never change. But for the rest of the people, how does one show them, that I'm not driven by bad motives? I don't know if you have an answer, but I'm going to throw it to you.
Yeah, well, I think that eventually you have to leave motives behind, and you have to say, look, I said I don't hate whoever, and you can believe it or not, but what should govern whether people believe something or not, it's not my motives, but the evidence. Here's the evidence. Look at this. And, I think the problem has been that people are, I think it's human, unfortunately, that people don't like to look at evidence that's uncomfortable to them for whatever reason. That might change their mind because, people like to look at evidence that supports what belief they already have.
Right. The confirmation bias has never been any stronger than it is these days.
Yeah.
I want to continue moving forward with the story because there are these different layers that I want to touch upon. So you were cleared of any wrongdoing. It was several years. It was very stressful. And that was on your professional side. Now, the other thing I forgot, shame on me, when I was saying all these horrible things about you in the intro, I forgot to mention that you also not only slept with these research participants you seduced, your subjects, but you did so while you were married with children. Yeah. Could you please, again, because that's the salacious aspect of it, that people just, again, one more thing that we can find out he's a monster. He's cheating on his wife with these trannies, And again, that offensive language I'm just throwing out there because that's the language that people are going to use when they get angry. So please, if anyone's watching, but when the people watch, that's not me using an offensive slur. Okay, I'm just mimicking the language of the hateful people out there. Could you please address? I'm sorry to bring up the salacious topic, but again, that was thrown out there.
No, it's fine. That's right. Among the many accusations against me was that I had sex with Juanita. I didn't. And actually, the particular accusation, I was fortunate that they, in the letter, they specified a date.
Right.
And I was also fortunate that I had proof that during that time I was in charge of my children when my ex-wife, because I was divorced, was going out of town. And, I forget how old my kids were, but, they were not like 17 and 18. They were much younger and, not leavable. At the same time, this accusation was aggravating in many ways. One of the ways it was aggravating is that really there would have been nothing wrong had I had sex with Juanita, which I didn't. But, she was somebody I knew. And I think that a lot of people would have found that idea salacious because she was transsexual.
And that you were married with children at the time, which you weren't.
Well, right. I wasn't married. I was single. Again, I didn't have sex then or ever with her. But if I had, it wouldn't have been a problem. It wouldn't have been anybody's business. And I think part of the accusation was that I was doing this and writing a book about her that she didn't know about. But again, none of that. She knew about the book. There was no sex. Right. I wasn't married. McCarthy could not have done as well, or whoever does these things these days.
It just goes to show to what ends people will, extend themselves to try to take somebody down. If we can't get him on facts, we're going to get him on motive. If we can't get him on motive, we're going to get him on character. If we can't get him on character, we're going to get him on just lies. And again, I think that you're saying that date that she had chosen, I think you had email correspondence with your ex-wife at the time, where you had some actual concrete evidence.
One other thing that I think is relevant, and anybody who denies that it's relevant to how bad this would have been had it happened, which it didn't, anybody who denies the relevance, I think, is being silly. Juanita, then, she was a sex worker. Anyway, again, but it didn't happen. And had it happened, it would have been, I suppose, embarrassing, but I don't think it would have been wrong.
Would you say, when you look back at how you wrote the book, okay, I'm just looking at some of the sections. One of the sections that people found, let's say, distasteful was the implication. I'm going to read this. Several of these jobs that you're talking about with respect to, the people that you were writing about happen to be in the sex trade, rather than saying they can also be lawyers and doctors. I'm thinking that people had picked up on that. They attacked you for trying to characterize all, transgender people as being, let's say, doomed to a certain future. They can be, tranny sex workers. Do you think that the wording was fair? It's good and people are reading too much into it? Should you have written it differently?
One can have more than one concern, I suppose. And, one could be trying to avoid hurt feelings and controversy, and one can be trying to convey the truth. And my bias has always been the latter. And in fact, a strongly disproportionate number of the non-autogynephilic transsexuals I met either were currently or had been in sex workers. And I think that is, it's a fact. And there are good reasons for it. And it's not, I think it's, in part because part of their brain is male, and males and females have different approaches to casual sex. And if one can make a living having sex with people and that you can actually have some choice over who it is, males can imagine that more easily than females. I don't think that there's any good evidence against what I was suggesting, and people who know these populations who I've talked to agree in private anyway. So I don't think there's anything wrong with being a sex worker either.
So you stand by that you're being descriptive, basically. You're saying, statistically speaking, this is the area in which certain people tend to find employment.
Yeah, and again, there are two types of transsexuals, and that applies to the one, which is the non-autogynephilic, or who I think I called them, Ray Blanchard calls them homosexual male to female transsexuals. So the kind who like men. Autogynephilic transsexuals, I don't think, are very common in sex work.
And some people take issue. I can't remember the exact wording, and I don't know if it was I can't remember if it was in the book, if I read it elsewhere. And again, you're going to say that it's factual. This is what you've experienced, and people still had their feelings hurt. Where you said that the autogynephilic man to woman transgender people, transsexuals, don't really make the transition so well. They don't present it very well as women. I forget the exact wording you used, but I'm being less blunt than I think that has come across. I can't remember if it was again. I can't remember in the book.
I said they're less attractive. This is on average. There are some attractive autogynephilic females, and there's some less attractive homosexual male to female transsexuals. But I think in general, that generalization is absolutely true.
It's funny because we spent all this time years ago. I mean, in the early days, let's say 30s, 40s, before then, we conflated gender identity, gender roles, sexual orientations. Like we took all these terms, and we weren't able to kind of parse them out. And we spent so many years trying to treat them separately. And now we're coming back to a sense of we're recognizing that there are correlations. For example, so that we know for a fact, gay men, people who turn out to be gay men, far more average than straight men, or far more likely than straight men, will, as children, be more effeminate, will be more, not adopting stereotypical gender roles and so on, right? We know this for fact, and I say this to my classes, that if I see somebody who's acting a certain way or looks a certain way, if I automatically assume they must be one way and I treat them differently because of that, that's inappropriate. But if I can say, statistically speaking, there is a correlation between someone's level of testosterone, or someone's, the play that they do as a child, or how they develop later on in life. We shouldn't be afraid to recognize that and talk about that, as long as we're not using it to define the person, say, well, that's all that you are as a person, or to somehow try to, denigrate them in some way. We're just speaking factually and saying this is a known correlation, right? Do you find, because I know you've made that comment, we've talked about, how the homosexual, transsexual, from a young age, was very effeminate, and they were pretty young boys and stuff like that. Do people just accuse you of stereotyping, or do people accept that there are legitimate studies that show that these correlations exist? What do you get on your end?
It's funny that the childhood gender nonconformity and its link to homosexuality. When I first started as an academic in the 90s, a lot of gay men were very uncomfortable with that. Some said that that's false. Some, said, well, it's true, but it really makes me uncomfortable.
Right.
And I think that we have really grown out of that discomfort largely due to things like, I don't know if you know this show, Queer Eye for the Straight Guy.
Yes. I've never watched it, but I know all about it, yes.
Okay, all right. I think it's become kind of acceptable or even to be a little cool to be, I don't know, in touch with one's gender nonconformity. And, it's really hard just to not notice something so obvious, too,
We even have the category of metrosexual, someone who is slightly lower on that scale, heterosexual, but, it's still, again, finding that the anima, the feminine side of them, that metrosexual side. So we were praising it to some degree. So it depends, depending on who, I guess, the people who are promoting it and how they're promoting it, then it's okay. But if the wrong people say it, then it's offensive. So,
yeah. And it's partly, I think that people have realized that it's really cruel to make fun of feminine boys. It's bad. My feminine gay friends are a lot of fun. I give me that any day over going to be macho and watching football with my straight friends. Anyway, we've gotten over that. So why can't we get over autogynephilia? Why can't we accept that some males have this thing that they eroticize the idea of being women. I suppose part of it is it's a little awkward. It's sex. It's sexual right there. Whereas gender nonconformity is a correlate of sex, but autogynephilia is a sexual interest. And
right. But I think that's where the problem is. And again, that's the one place in all of this where I'm not willing. I can't go that far. Where I've had people look me in the eye and I've worked with them and they say, truly, there's not an erotic component to it, at least as far as this need to be a difference in physical sex. I understand your point, and for the people watching this, I say my position is I take them at their word. I do believe there are at least 3 different conditions under which people, do feel the need to transition or to at least express themselves. So that's and I think that's what's that will follow you forever, and that's probably where you're gonna have the biggest protests is the people say that that's not my experience.
But I will just clarify that when a straight man goes to have a romantic dinner with his wife of 25 years, that is not a sexual experience. But there's a way in which it is strongly related to his sexual history and so on. And I think the same analogy is pertinent for some autogynephilic males and their eventual transition. Anne Lawrence has made this wonderful argument that, attachment and romance are part of this too, and it's not that an autogynephilic male is, if I can only get a sex change, it's like going to be the biggest orgasm ever. But back in the day, I would wager if we could take a camera back to their adolescent bedroom, I think we would likely see those kinds of behavior. Ask them what they were like as adolescents, and ask them if they ever did. Maybe you do already. Do you ask them whether they ever cross-dressed erotically?
Yeah, and I've had a couple who it's tricky because they didn't cross-dress erotically, but they did, wearing their hair longer when it wasn't socially appropriate and stuff like that. So, they're touching upon that where I could see that there's several levels, but they didn't go to the next step or to several steps further. And are they not telling me the truth? I can't say for certain. I take them at their word. So you may.
As in therapy, you should, unless there would be some clear benefit to challenging them. I can't think of what it would be.
Again, I've had a number of people who have denied to me that was a component of it, and whether they just weren't aware.
I have lots of people deny this to me. So I suppose the question we're debating here is, what is the relevance of these denials? How seriously must we take them? And I don't take them as seriously as you might be, because they happen even among people who are obviously autogynephilic, and the people who are denying them look pretty much the same as the people who are not denying them. So that's why I don't.
Right. I'd say at this point, that's more of a choice that we each make on how we interpret people's recounting of their experience. But you also mentioned cross-dressing, for example, where I think that's another area where a number of years ago, I can't put a date on it, but it became, for whatever reason, in the press at least, a bit more popular, where they talked about the fact that, and it blew a lot of people's minds, that so many cross-dressers, male cross-dressers, aren't gay. It's not about that. So we're getting all this information, little bits and pieces, and we're trying to get a more coherent picture of all of this. But but these kind of things, again, I can't remember if there was a researcher in particular, but it just became more of a common knowledge. They said that cross-dressing men aren't necessarily gay. They're getting some other, it's some other phenomenon other than that. And and to me, just so you know, my mother opened up Canada's first sex store. In 1972. So for me, all of the intricacies and the variations of sexuality, it was just par for the course. From a very young age, I was raised in that environment. So I'm fascinated with just how diverse we are as humans. And so there's no judgment on my end when I see it, right? So I want to know more about this. I want people to know more about it, because the sad thing is, I've worked with so many people, whether they are gay, bisexual, transgender, whatever it is, when they aren't allowed to be who they are as people, or they feel that there's a shame for who they are as an individual. They can't even tell their parents. They have to wear a mask their whole life. I've seen the damage it done. I know you've seen the damage it has done. It ruins people's lives. There's a reason there's such high suicide rates among these populations. And so all I want is, I just want people to have a better understanding of this. And even if feelings are hurt in the process, if in the long run we find out more about our human sexuality as human beings, I think it's only good. And again, you were one of the earlier people in that area. You also caught a lot of the flack. But and that's why I wanted to have you on here, to have a human being, a face-to-face discussion with someone who took the risks, took the chances before it was popular. Okay, you were doing this before it became, the cause the celeb. You're leading the way, or you were leading the way to help people understand, the human condition. People might dislike certain things you say. They might not like your attitude or anything else like that. But I just want you to continue helping us understand who we are. And so I thank you personally, face-to-face. I want to thank you for the work that you have done. And you continue to do it despite all the flack that you've caught.
Well, thanks.
So then the two more things, just go throw it out there. We've gone for a long time, but I appreciate this time, so I want to throw two more things because I alluded to them. Number one, you stepping outside your area of expertise to write a letter to for someone's transition. Can you briefly explain that, just so people understand what you did and why?
Yeah. So in order to qualify for sex reassignment surgery, transsexual women need letters from two experts, and they asked me to write for them, various friends of Angelica, and I did so for free. I did so after talking with them once or twice at length, just to make sure that I felt like they knew what they were doing. And in the letters, I would say, I believe I said I'm an expert, because I had written this book section, and I knew a lot more than most people, including most people who were working for a living with these folks. But my saying I'm an expert, that's my opinion. I provided my curriculum vitae with the letter, and I said, I'm not licensed as a clinical psychologist, though I'm trained as one. And I let them decide whether they want to use my letter. And they always did. That was just another avenue where they tried to attack me. They framed that as practicing clinical psychology without a license. If I had said, I'm a clinical psychologist and I charged them for money and for the letter and so on, that would have been more arguable. But I just wrote as an academic, as a professor of psychology who knows something. And that's all I presented myself as doing, and that's all I did.
But the headlines were, this is one more example of his lack of ethics. And again, that's why I wanted people to understand that. And I think you're very upfront and transparent. I saw the how that was revealed. You weren't misrepresenting yourself, So that's number one. Then number two, and again, having taught human sexuality for the past 15 years or so, almost 15 years, I've got to appreciate this because I've never gone this far. So please tell how you corrupted the children of America one day in your class, which has led to you. And I think, unfortunately, you are no longer teaching that class, or have you gone back to teaching it?
No, I'm not. This was in 2011. So I taught the largest class at Northwestern. It had about 600 undergraduates, human sexuality. And I would have lectures that I thought should be very content-oriented. And I taught it with a scientific, probably biological bias. And I also had a component in the class which was entirely voluntary, and it was after-class events. Sometimes these would be movies, like I would show My Life in Pink, about the little boy who wanted to be a girl. But I would also bring interesting people. Angelica, the transsexual, did this until we fell out in 2003. I would have a panel of gay men who would be very open about their sex lives, which are quite something compared with the average straight guy sex and straight woman sex life. Bring in a dominatrix. Although the year before, she was kind of boring and I think maybe not entirely honest. And that one thing I didn't like is when people would say, with these, like a dominatrix would come and say, this has nothing to do with sex. It's about, control or losing yourself. And, it just didn't seem plausible to me. But anyway, in 2011, I invited this guy who was kind of a character, but I think he was into interesting stuff, to convene an after-class panel on kinky people. And he did, and they came, and they came to my class as I was finishing up my lecture, and I was talking about female ejaculation, and I was saying, I think the nature of female ejaculation is controversial. Some people don't even believe it exists as ejaculation. So as soon as I was done, the guy who I had invited, and so we're done, I say, okay, the kinky people are going to be presenting in 5 minutes. Those of you who don't want to stay, please leave. Those of you who are staying, But during that time, he said, she would like to demonstrate female ejaculation for the class. Is that okay? And so what I felt was, and what I said was, yeah. And why did I do that? Well, I think in part I had just been reading Mary Roach's book about history of sex research and so on, and about how some of the people like Kinsey had been persecuted. And I was kind of in a mood like, I don't want to be part of the squeamish, and there's nothing wrong with that. But anyway, they set up, and what does that mean for this? So there was like a chair, and they had this sex toy that was going to induce her to orgasm and to ejaculate. And all the while, I am very anxious and just hoping that this is over soon and that everybody's okay. And I twice say, if they're going to do this, if anybody's uncomfortable, please leave now. So it happened. I don't think that she was able to ejaculate. I didn't exactly see, but they said that it didn't really work. Though, she was brought to orgasm by this thing. And then we had a nice hour-long presentation by this group, and everybody in class who stayed was fine with it, thought it was interesting. And my hope was that I'd kind of gotten through this. But I don't know, it was maybe a week later that I heard from a reporter for the student newspaper who was actually in the class, and they were going to write an article about this. And I didn't cooperate. Nevertheless, they wrote an article that was a pretty good article. And I thought when I read the article, hey, that's pretty good. Maybe it's okay. But as soon as the article was published, Fox News picked it up and called me, and I didn't talk to them, but nevertheless, I knew immediately it was going way bigger than I wanted. And by the next day, so this was on St. Patrick's Day, 2011, and by the next day, it was an international scandal, and the president of the university, I think, had already condemned what I did. He didn't say, I'm going to fire him, but he said, I think this shows really bad judgment. And I guess in retrospect it did, in the sense that, the costs were not worth the benefits. The costs included eventually the university removing the class, the most popular class. It was not only popular, it was a great class. I'm to this day very proud of the class, and I think it was very useful to them. And I think that I challenged them in ways that you seem to challenge your class, and I changed minds, and that doesn't happen anymore.
So the whole human sexuality class is gone. They don't even have another professor.
It wasn't replaced. There is a class that was kind of promoted as a replacement, even though I don't think it's really anything like it, being done in gender studies. And, I am very opposite to gender studies in so many ways. So I think it's a very poor substitute for my class.
Right. And I do want to say that the one thing, and I say this to my students, like I've taught 20 different courses at university, all in psychology, and human sexuality was the one course I've done for, again, almost 15 years, if not more. I always tell them, I say, anything I tell you, you can find on Google. You can find somewhere else. I said, it's not about me trying to bring materials that you don't know. It's about me helping you to become critical thinkers and to truly be able to confront these ideas. Because, I never use the term trigger warning or anything like that. And as I'm sure you did in your human sexuality class, you were dealing with some very controversial, challenging topics that many people were likely triggered or potentially triggered. But if it's presented in a way that's not, okay guys, be ready, I'm about to tell you the worst scary thing in the world, shh, hold my hand. If it's not presented that way, people don't react that way. And so if they're able to overcome it, and a lot of students may not like what I or what you said, as far as like theoretically, if you said, how would you feel about this topic? But because it's presented in a factual, humor is always good as well, in a way that just helps them to be able to tolerate the discomfort that they might feel in being confronted with these things. This is what makes somebody, helps make them a critical thinker, number one. And to deny that sex, or such an important part of the human condition, is silly. So if we can help people discuss, hear, think about, really contemplate these very dark topics, these taboo topics or whatever, and they're able to actually process it. That can only help humanity. Yet in university, the one place that is supposed to be happening is the one place where it's not happening anymore. I pulled a muscle getting on my pulpit here, but
no, that's you are absolutely right. And in the United States, we've had a really terrible development related to sex in terms of the whole, I think, false epidemic of sexual assault on campus and epidemic of misery related to it. That I think is part of that. His unwillingness to talk about difficult sex-related ideas.
Right, and as soon as you say that, now you're a rape apologist. Now you're just promoting rape culture. Like, we've lost nuance. It's not as bad in Canada yet as it is in the States, but we are heading in that direction. And no right-minded person would deny that the thesis behind it, or the idea of don't rape people. I don't think anyone would deny.
I'm with you. Don't rape.
I don't mean to be too controversial.
Actually, don't grope people even. Don't reach their. Don't be jerks to women. Right.
It's like, who would deny that? A normal thinking person wouldn't deny that. But when it gets taken too far and it becomes unrealistic, and by the way, I talk about this in my class, this idea of consent. I say, of course, we should be teaching children consent from a very young age. Learn to protect yourself. Have pride in your body and who you are. Learn to have healthy boundaries. Learn to be able to negotiate this.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting.
That's the new wave, and they're being taught.
A demonstration. Yeah.
And by my saying this, now people are going to label me as a rape apologist versus saying, what I'm teaching my students is the reality is most people aren't going to do that. So if you find yourself in a situation where that's not happening, I want to equip you with the tools to be able to say, I'm not comfortable with this, or physically to show that. Versus, wouldn't it be nice if everybody had this discussion beforehand and it would be nice, but that's not how reality is. So we need to learn, we need to operate or teach people how to operate within the reality that is, not with what we want it to be.
Right.
So anyway, that's one more little thing I just have to throw out there, and that's a big change I'm seeing on campus over the last number of years, both in Canada and in the United States. And it's forcing people to be non-human beings.
Yeah.
That's not how we operate.
That's what you say.
Again, I've component of my classes for so many years. I've speculated about things. I've put it out there. I've given students a chance to see your work, and this is my first time actually having it face to face with you, and I really do appreciate it. I respect the work that you do, and I hope that people will look into the materials that you've, like for example, your book. I'll put on my website. And again, thank you so much for taking the time and just
It's a pleasure. It was great. You're very thoughtful.
Well, thank you. So anyway, take care. All the best to you.